The first point you have to deal with when you're living in space for a long time, unlike those short missions, is you don't know what's coming the next week. You are not prepared for it. To be straight and honest about it, I think it was the glamour of my father being a Royal Air Force pilot flying jets, and then watching the Apollo 11 moon landing. I was in Malta at the time. My father was based there. I was about 11 years old. And that was so exciting for me. My mother had been giving me science fiction books from about the age of 10. And together that made me say, space is it. But then, as I realized that I wanted to do this and I had to figure out how to do it, I was disappointed in not being able to join the Royal Air Force. I won't go there. It was to do with how I took the eyesight test when I was 15. So I focused on becoming a scientist astronaut. That was the way I wanted to get into space. And I became an experimental physicist at Cambridge University, Queen's College, Cambridge. I got a first in physics and natural sciences and then did the PhD in 3 years' time, which is pretty fast, knowing that was the ticket I needed to become an astronaut. And at that time, the space shuttle program was announced and coming into my consciousness, and I started to really target that as the program I wanted to join. There were European astronauts being selected to fly on the space shuttle in that time frame, and I spoke to one candidate who was a professor in Cambridge of the British Antarctic Survey, and I was helped by him in developing my CV, my resume, as we call it in America. I should say, after I got to NASA and banged on the door and said, can I be an astronaut? And they said, well, you need a bit more experience. I began to realize that my actual day-to-day reasons for wanting to be an astronaut were more relevant to everyday endeavor. That is, working in a big team, working on something that other people really value, going somewhere where people care about what happens. When I was finally selected as an astronaut, it was on my third try, and I've been rejected twice in 2 previous selections beforehand. Got to the last 100, but then was told I didn't make it. I was selected in my third try when I was 30 years old, and there we had to write an essay about why you want to be an astronaut, and I'd written thousands of words in the previous ones about it's the destiny of humankind, it'll protect us when we meet the aliens, it'll help us survive the asteroid impact, all those sorts of things. But those didn't really register with the astronaut selection board. What really registered was after the Challenger accident. This was a space shuttle that took off, blew up after 70 seconds and killed 7 crew, including the first teacher in space. And it was right after that accident that I made my application. And I just said, I like being part of a team that's trying to do something big and important that we all value. And it was that maturity, I think, and also the fact that I've been working in the space program for a bit as an operations person, someone who got the experiments together to go onto the space shuttle and to be deployed into space. I said, I like being part of that team. I like working on these details about how to make a high-performing system work and be part of that team. And lo and behold, I was selected. So it's really, to summarize it, it's a hard, I wanted to solve hard problems that have real consequences if you do it wrong, and be part of a big, mission team that's bigger than me. I should say I've flown 6 times in space, and the first 3 missions were for only 10 days at a time. So my cumulative time in space in 1997, before May, was about a month at the most. And I had done a spacewalk in that time frame and done 2 science missions. But they were what I would call military attack scenarios. They're where you have a mission, you go and do it, you've trained thousands of times, and you do it pretty much flawlessly. And you have a big team on the ground that's helping you. And then you come back and you go, phew, that's over, done. And that was 3 missions, about 10 days at a time. My first long duration mission And I've done 2 of those that add up to a year to be relevant to your question. My first long duration mission was on my 4th space shuttle flight, where they dropped me off at the Russian Mir space station. And the Russian Mir space station was already in space about 13 years at that time, and was quite in a state of decay, I would say, disrepair. There are all kinds of political things going on in Russia at that time. The support for the Russian space program was weak, monetarily within Russia. So the United States, President Clinton came up with a program to help pay the Russian space program. And you think, why would it do that? That was to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons that were present all throughout the Soviet Union being distributed, and the knowledge on how to use those, and the knowledge how to throw those with rockets. They came up with this program called the International Space Station, which, by the way, was my second long duration flight. And the International Space Station, I think, was a great result out of this rather prosaic geopolitical motivation to send money to Russia for the Russian space program. So anyway, I was part of this program. A lot of my colleagues in the astronaut office who are military, I'm not military, didn't really agree with it, but they go along with it because they want to fly in space. And I went along with it because it was my 4th flight. I didn't know when I was going to fly again in space. There's always a queue, people trying to fly as a government astronaut anyway. I arrived at the Mir, and there was a real calamity, and we'll get to that in another question, where a cargo ship collided with us, crashed into us, caused a leak, caused us to lose a module, actually 3 modules, the use of them, lose power, completely dead station, and then we had to recover. So on the Mir, I was living with 2 Russians. They didn't speak English. So the first point you have to deal with when you're living in space for a long time, unlike those short missions, is you don't know what's coming the next week. You are not prepared for it. You've got general skills, you've got general scientific knowledge about the experiments you're doing, you've got general knowledge about the systems you need to repair, but you don't know what's coming the next week. And you don't know what's going to need to be repaired the next week. And so the big key to living a long time in space, and this was emphasized on my space station flight. So last flight, I did a repair of the Hubble telescope in between. But my last flight, I was launched on a Russian Soyuz rocket to the International Space Station. And I was the commander of one person, a Russian. And there we were a maintenance crew, the janitors, and it was right after the 2nd space shuttle accident, Columbia, and the space shuttle was grounded. No more big American crews could come up and do all these construction activities that were going on the ISS. Instead, I was launched on this Russian rocket with Alexander Kalery, I call him Sasha, to live for 6 months. And so that's where it adds up to a year in orbit. And that year in orbit was all about making sure I got along with Sasha, even though I'm the commander. We have to get along for half a year in space. So that was the first thing, respecting your crew members. We did have a visiting crew a couple of times. And then working well with the ground teams who are going home on the weekends, they've got their families to visit, etc. But you're in space on your own. And we now have to, Sasha and I he has to maintain most of the Russian parts of the station. I have to maintain all of the European, American and Japanese parts of and the Canadian parts of the space station. But it was mostly maintenance. There were experiments, but I would say 70 to 80% of my time on the International Space Station in that time frame was maintenance, and about 20% were experiments. So there was psychological fatigue. Sometimes you lost focus. We had a leak, a slow progressive leak that took me a week to try and figure out where it was. The ground teams, as I say, they go home on the weekends. I had failures of our comms on a Friday evening. And I know if I don't get these comms sorted out, I'm going to have to write down about 500 words or 1,000 words of instructions on Monday morning. So that's the sort of thing where I now have to go off and try and solve that comms problem without the team on the ground because they've gone home. And then they got all angry with me on the Monday morning because I didn't, I went ahead and fixed it. The missions on the space shuttle are deployment missions. They're rapid missions. You've been trained. Going to the International Space Station, going to Mars, going to the moon, they're like going in a motorhome, in an RV that keeps breaking down. And you have to deal with those problems as they come along. And you need resilience in your attitude, confidence in your colleagues, in your crew that are with you, and you need persistence. And basically, I think you have to be fairly optimistic, because otherwise it will get you down. Risk in general is really general public's view of spaceflight misunderstood. They think of risk as an explosion, and that's what it comes down to. That's why people that's why people are scared when they come to watch you launch. That's why you're scared when you get to launch, is that you're thinking of the big explosion, the one big event. But most of the risk is a slow drift away from what you know is right to what is convenient now and you don't think is really wrong. So it's the biggest risk is deviation from normal operations. And I think we use the word drift or normalization of deviance. And what that means is that slowly in risk, and I know a lot about risk mitigation, there's almost always, even in the big blowups, there's a series of smaller events that have all occurred, and the chance of each is quite small. And so the chance of all of them, if you multiply the probabilities, is even smaller. But nonetheless, it's not zero. And it's this thing called the accident chain. And as you drift away from your originally planned, verified operational procedures, you start to increase the risk in each of those chain links, until eventually an accident happens. And the most common form of risk is where the human and the machine working together, like think pilot in a cockpit, start to deviate from what was originally planned. And you get small anomalies starting to accumulate. Probably the Mir space station was the best example of this, where because it was aging rather badly, some people age well. Some machines age well if they're maintained. You can fly airliners that are 50 years old if they're maintained and you haven't moved away from the original intention of how they were designed to be flown. But if you get this drift away from normal operations, and you keep adding on systems that haven't been, we use the word integration in the space industry, haven't been properly integrated into the system, you get this normalization of deviance. And the Mir had that happening. And I think the best example of it was the collision that happened to us, because there on the ground, mission managers who wanted to make money, actually save money, they wanted to stop paying Ukraine $2 million per radar box that was being used to allow the cargo ships to come into the Mir. They wanted to save that money. But why did they have the radar? So they didn't want to buy the radar box. They had decided they needed the radar box 30 years before that, older men, because they knew they needed the radar to slow it down so it could come into the space station safely. But at this point, when I was on the Mir, the managers had decided that maybe we can do away with that. And we'll have the crew take the place of the radar box, but without a radar. My crew were told to try and measure the distance in place of the radar, looking at graph paper, looking at the TV screen and drawing lines on the screen and seeing how big the space station Mir looked, and then go to a table and figure out what the distance was. But all this happens in a matter of seconds, so they couldn't keep up. And this vehicle hit us. So the decision to make that was the deviance from what the Russians had originally designed a good system, and it worked well, but then they deviated from it progressively. And because they didn't want to pay for the machine, they started to turn off the machine or not use the machine. And so that was a very good example of how drift and normalization of deviance leads to a catastrophic event. we humans have to develop trust in our AI at a human rate. What I mean by that is we can only introduce AI so fast as the humans, not understanding how it works, can accept it. And then I go right back to my space shuttle pilots never accepting Autoland in the space shuttle. And the only way to build trust, and I think of AI as people. If you want to solve a problem in AI, think, well, how does a human do it? And then go right back to the AI. That's how I model it. So if you want to build trust in a human, you have to be predictable, repeatable, definitely not excited and not random. The takeaway for an audience is that we have an enormous amount of work to do, incrementally improving the adoption of AI into human endeavor, especially when it has any kind of real world consequence.